It's midterm time. It is time to prepare for what will be the hardest test you've taken this year. If you've been prepared, you've studied, you've done what you're supposed to, you'll be fine. But remember, this is a mandatory portion of your grade due to the fact that this is a high school credit course. So we'll see just how well you do, how hard you prepare. But don't worry, that's what this is for. This is the review guide for your midterm for Pre-AP World History and Geography. Let's begin. So remember that this midterm is a big part of your grade, and it is an important part of your grade, being that unlike your middle school classes where you have quarters 1, 2, 3, and 4, your midterm is its own separate grade that factors in your overall midterm grade, aka the grades for semester 1. So what you're going to definitely need to be able to do is perform well on this test. Now keep in mind, you guys have done really well so far when it comes to looking at your learning checkpoints, and definitely when I looked at your performance tests. You guys have done really good. But now we definitely need to kick it up a notch because this midterm is going to be worth a big chunk of your grade, and as well as the fact that it is different than the learning checkpoint and the performance task because myself and Miss Lowe created this test. What we're going to begin with is the age of exploration, and we have to think of it more than just Europe and what was going on there, because really the Middle East was crucial in this point. Also, Africa and Asia were the places that most of them wanted to go to for the lush amounts of natural resources, spices, and luxury goods that many of these cultures desired. So in order for us to get a good understanding of the age of exploration, we need to know what was the technology that was used to get them from place to place. Most travel was done regional, so from port to port in relative short distances that they can maintain. Oceans were dangerous, and they really didn't know which way they were going. That was until two critical inventions, the astrolabe and the magnetic compass. Most of you are familiar with the magnetic compass, right? So that little box, that little device that has a little needle, and it points true north. Well, we use that to help us get a good idea of which general direction we go north. So if we know that this direction is north, then we know which direction we are going at that point. But the astrolabe was also being used. Now, we had talked about this in class, and we talked about how the ancient Polynesian empires would go and use their hands and kind of go like this, and using it as almost like a compass, but a geometric compass, in order for them to create angles to which they are going to a designated star. So that would help them navigate using the stars in the sky in which direction they were going. Well, an astrolabe was a little device that looked a little bit more like a compass that you would use in geometry class that gave them an exact number in terms of the angle to which they are at a designated star, and that would give them more precise calculations in terms of which way they're going. So without these two pieces of critical technology that were developed in the Middle East around the 1200s, most seafaring expeditions would have failed right then and there. So cartographers at the time, these are map makers, so that way you know what that means. These map makers really needed to be a little bit more precise in order to make a large-scale expedition even possible. Now, why would Europe even want to get involved in the age of exploration? And that's a pretty critical question that we have to think about. And the reason they did was because they were introduced to luxury goods that they had that they really needed at this time. So what they really wanted was access to goods like silk, porcelain, ivory, spices, perfumes, silver especially, things that they did not have abundance of in Europe. But where they had these were out in Asia. Now, the reason that we knew about those things in most of Western Europe is because of two particular situations. One was a man by the name of Marco Polo. We've all played the game of the pool where you go and try to tag somebody in the pool, Marco Polo, and we do all that, right? Well, Marco Polo was a real man. He was from the city of Genoa in Italy. Actually, no, I am wrong. That's Christopher Columbus. He is from Genoa. Marco Polo is Venetian, I believe. He's from Venice. Am I right? Is it Venice? Someone double check. I'll give you a piece of candy if you get it right. But Marco Polo is from northern Italy, and he would actually travel all the way to China by foot. And this expedition would be eventually create what we now know as the Silk Road. He actually met with Kublai Khan of the great Mongolian Empire and established a trade route between Italy and Asia. And by doing this, he introduced large amounts of Europe to these luxurious goods. And most of Europe really didn't have very nice things like silk. They had wool, which is itchy. So they really wanted access to these goods, so they eventually would get their hands on these goods. But that created a particular problem for Western Europe. We already talked about how the Middle East had already quickly developed most of the technology in order for large seafaring, so they've conquered large seafaring already, and the Italians had already created the Silk Road that led them to be the distributors of most of these luxury goods to the rest of Europe. So Europeans had to pay a premium to get most of these goods. So how would they get away from it? Well, they would have to sail around them. Kind of like if you had a bully who would block your path to the cafeteria and they would take your lunch money. Well, is there a better way to get to the cafeteria without having to cross that bully? Well, usually means you're gonna have to go a little bit of a longer route, but if you can take that route, you get to keep your lunch money and you get to have lunch. So really, Western powers started creating different routes to get there. And the country that really dominated this in Western Europe, at least in the beginning, was Portugal. And this is what we would call the Iberian exploration period. Now remember, the Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that incorporates Spain and Portugal, and let's not forget Andorra, which is like this big, right? So we need to know that they existed. But still, it was Portugal that dominated. And we all remember that man, Prince Henry the Navigator. He was a Portuguese member of royalty who created a school to teach members of pretty much anybody within Portugal how to go and create maps, use this new technology, build caravels, which were the type of ships that were really large above the surface, shallow under the surface, so it can actually go close to land, but it's strong enough to withstand the ocean's waves. So by creating this school, he sent out numerous expeditions under the guise of the state. So the state actually ran and paid for these expeditions, and we had a couple of really successful ones, most notably Vasco da Gama. We remember Vasco da Gama by sailing all the way underneath the southern tip of Africa and back up again to the Cape of Good Hope, and made it all the way to India in about a 9-month journey. This opened the door to Western Europe having a route to get to Africa and Asia and the West India, or the Asia, not the West Indies, what am I doing? All the way up to the Spice Islands, which is modern day Indonesia and the Philippines, and they wanted access to these goods. Granted, it was a really long trip. That's a really long time. And like that was going on at the time, Spain's getting a little jelly bellies. They're seeing what's going on over here, and they want to get on a piece of this action because they don't want to get left out in the cold. So all this is going on, and we come to the realization that there might be another way to get to Asia. What if instead of just sailing under Africa and going east, what if we just go west? And a man from Genoa, this time I'm right, has this brilliant plan, if you will. His name is Christopher Columbus, and he's like, hey, how about we sail west and make it back to the east again? Well, here's the thing about Columbus. He wasn't the first person to come up with this idea, nor would he be the last person to try it. He was just the first one to get state sponsoring to do it, and it wasn't Italy that sponsored him, because Italy's like, we already have a path, we don't need this. Then you go to France, they're not ready for it. England, they have their own issues going on at this time. And eventually it would be Spain with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and they would be like, hey man, listen, if you can get us that money, here you go on ahead. And they go ahead and commission his expedition, and off he goes. And remember, he made it to India 4 times. Except he didn't. Never even made it close. Remember, he missed it by about 10,000 miles. He actually made it to the Caribbean, most notably Cuba and the Bahamas. He didn't even come close. In fact, it's like if I went for a high five and you hit the back of my heel. Not even a little bit close. But he did introduce and open up what we now know as the Columbian Exchange. And this was that transmittance of goods from Asia. What am I doing? These are the transmittance of goods from Europe to the New World, aka North and South America, and from North and South America back to Europe. And those goods and services and, unfortunately, diseases were things that were being traded back and forth. So remember, Columbus didn't just bring Christianity and civilization to the New World, he unfortunately brought smallpox to the New World, which wiped out 80% of the native populations in these areas, which made colonization of these areas really difficult. So when we got to this point, we would start to see the creation of the triangular trade. We would start to see goods that were being produced specifically in the South and North and Central American regions, like coffee and sugar, being produced, cotton and other goods, and that would be traded back to Europe. Europe would take these goods and they would want them. They would send manufactured metals to Africa because many African nations at this time, specifically the Kingdom of Congo, desired these goods. And then they would assist in what was created, unfortunately at this time, the Atlantic slave trade. Slaves were the primary good that were being brought into the North and South America to tend to these large-scale agricultural systems. So if we think about it, what were being produced in these areas? Well, first off, if you go into Mexico and the Andes Mountains, which is in western part of South America, you're going to find that they were silver mines. Why were they mining silver? You'd think, why don't we look for gold? That makes more sense. The entire Chinese economy at this time, remember, the whole world's globally connected. The entire Chinese economy was based on silver. Now, for a long time, China got its needs met by the Japanese in terms of their silver production. However, when the Tokugawa shogunate, which is a type of government, we'll talk about them later, don't worry. When the Tokugawa shogunate took over, they severely limited that silver trade. So China had money, China had needs, China needed their needs met. And fortunately for them, Mexico and the Andes Mountains had plenty of silver to help feed that large Chinese economy. Because if that large Chinese economy is booming, they are producing all sorts of silks and porcelain goods and things that Europeans wanted, which expanded the desire for trade. So remember, something being found in one place can directly affect something being produced in another place. So because of this, that was big part of what was being brought over from the North and South American colonies. But another one was, again, of course, sugar. Now, sugar was the biggest part of the Brazilian good. It was a large part of what Brazilian goods were being produced. But sugar, unlike other crops, required intense labor, large amounts of labor that takes a long amount of time in order for them to get goods from one place to where they're trying to go. And it required slave labor. And this is where the majority of slaves would actually end up, is in Brazil. And unfortunately, that led to the transportation of these slaves coming in large boats known as, the portion that we need to know is the Middle Passage. So this is the portion where slaves were brought from Africa, typically places like Ghana, Senegal, Sierra Leone, all the way over to Brazil. And that passage, that point from when they leave the slave castle in Africa, that little building that would house the slaves, and once they're in the Atlantic, that is the Middle Passage. And that's where we saw large numbers of slaves unfortunately die on the journey, because remember, as we discussed in class, it was more about quantity over quality. So they could easily have shipped 100 slaves on a ship and kept them healthy and safe, or they could send 600 slaves, lose 20% of them, but they're still getting more slaves over at a time. Thus, it was more financially feasible for them to do these really dangerous and long seafaring expeditions. So we need to make sure that we understand that the Middle Passage is that portion where slaves were treated very poorly. We looked at pictures of the conditions that slaves operated under during the Middle Passage, people being lined up head to toe, stacked on top of one another in very small, short bunks, limited exposure to fresh air. Disease and illness was rampant in these slave ships. The conditions were utterly horrifying that these slaves had to undergo. And then once they made it to the New World, it was nearly as bad, if not worse, because one of the main reasons that slave labor was needed for a sugar plantation, not only is it backbreaking work in really hot conditions over long periods of time, but malaria was a problem. It was a mosquito-borne illness in which mosquitoes that typically reproduce and lay their eggs in large bodies of water, which is what's needed to grow sugar. So malaria spread like wildfire, and yellow fever was a problem, and it created a lot of issues for slaves once they made it to the New World. So we need to understand, to wrap a lot of this up, is that this push for new luxurious golden items and things that was brought on by the creation of the Silk Road. I didn't even bring up the fact that Europe underwent the Crusades during this time to try to bring the Holy Land back into Christian control. But once they made it over into the Middle East, into these other areas, such as the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, and we'll talk about the Mughals later, but they had their hands on luxurious trade goods from Asia. And this was the first time a lot of these European nations had really seen these things, and then they really wanted them. They really wanted to get those things. So when it comes to the age of exploration, because this was a lot that we kind of underwent. In fact, if I look at my handy dandy notebook here, I still think I have a little bit more left to go over. We didn't really even get into, I talked a little bit about the global China. I think I did a good job. So let's take a look at that. So let's just to make sure, just to clarify, we remember that China was the largest state economically in the world at this time in the early modern period. Japan was what helped fuel this expansion of power because of their silver production. But once the Tokugawa shogunate came into power, that silver reduced. But fortunately, Portugal and Spain started colonizing South America. Thus, the Andes Mountains and Mexico would help resupply this need and desire and feed the insatiable hunger for silver in China, thus maintaining its economy. Now, all that being done, Europe was creating these multinational organizations through the Dutch and the English, mixing in with places that they are colonizing to create these large, expansive imperial conquests that would lead to what we call the system of mercantilism. And that's what we're going to get to on the next part.